Welcome back to the Inner Scoreboard. I'm your host, Paul Brown, registered psychotherapist and mental performance coach. In the last episode, we explored what identity is, how it develops, and why your identity should always be bigger than your performance, your career, or any single role you play in life. Today, we're taking the next step because understanding identity is one thing, rebuilding it after it's been disrupted is something entirely different. Maybe you've been injured and can't compete the way you once did. Maybe you've retired from a sport or a career. Maybe you've been cut from a team, lost a relationship, received a difficult diagnosis, or even experienced a trauma that changed the direction of your life. Whatever the disruption, one question often follows: who am I? Today, I'm going to explore what happens when the future you expected suddenly disappears, why that experience often feels like grief, and how you begin reconstructing a sense of identity that isn't defined by what you've lost. I'll talk about identity collapse, reconstruction, quantum change, and what I call future branching. The idea that even when one path disappears, others still exist. Because identity reconstruction isn't about getting back to who you were, it's about discovering who you can become. Let's get started. As a quick recap from last episode, identity is a state of being and becoming. It's a combination of your past, your present, and your projected future. So a sense of where you come from, who you are right now, and your sense of where you're going. And our identity often remains unconscious until we're asked to either define it or until it's become disrupted in some way. Today, I'm going to focus on what happens when identity is disrupted and how to move forward from that. Disruptions are often associated with grief and loss, but they can also be related to additions or even planned changes. So one example can be the birth of your first child. So when that happens, you might start questioning who you are as a parent because you don't actually have experience in that role. Maybe it's getting a new job or making a new team and trying to find your place in that environment. You may have been an absolute rock star in your former team, but now you're playing at a higher level and you might just be average. Or maybe you're vice versa. You were average on a previous team and you've gone down a level and now you're the absolute rock star. There's now a disruption as you try to navigate your place and who you are on the new team. If your identity has been tied to performance outcomes, this can be even more complicated. When we shift our attention to disruptions surrounding loss, we naturally think of death as the cause. But it can be any loss. It can be the loss of relationships, it can be loss of occupation, physical ability, or mental ability. Sobriety is another example that can create this disruption because as you're getting sober, it can contribute to a feeling of loss because there's often a loss of friendships as well as a loss of familiarity. Again, that child being born, there you might be excited about your child being born, but now there's a loss of independence and who you were as a single person. Mark Manson, who wrote The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, he references a term called identity collapse. So this is when the disruption is involuntary and it's triggered by a significant event like a crisis, a significant loss, or even the threat of a significant loss. One example that comes to mind as a threat is a medical diagnosis. So maybe it's a terminal diagnosis or one that predicts a significant decline of some sort. And I just said significant a lot. And I think that reinforces that these disruptions are not simple day-to-day changes. That's why Manson's idea of collapse really resonates because it reinforces, well, that it's a significant change. When we experience these disruptions or collapses, some form of grief typically follows. And grief is a normal response to a sense of loss, and that loss creates awareness of identity. So it's kind of like walking into a room and there has always been a specific chair in that room. Now that chair is missing, but we're used to it being there. So then the thoughts come to your mind of where do I sit now that the chair is gone? With that chair gone, a void now exists that needs to be filled. And it fractures the sense of self, of our current self, because our projected self is no longer an option. And if those fractures are left unresolved, then there is a deterioration of mental health like anxiety, depression, substance misuse. And this often occurs when there are major life changes, but not always. So when I retired from fitness competition, it did not create an identity disruption for me at all. I was still very much involved in the fitness community, and I was still kind of, doing lots of TV appearances and writing and kind of riding on the coattails of my competition career. One of the biggest differences was that the change from my competing to retiring was completely my choice. It was well planned and actually part of a larger plan at that time. My projected future remained intact because I had a plan and was able to execute my plan, mostly. The example of a collapse happened 2 years later when I had my motorcycle accident. So obviously that was not planned, and as a result of my injuries, my projected future was no longer an option. I was off work for over 2 years as a result of my injuries and kind of had to figure out how to walk again and who I was as a person. Other examples can include being cut from a team or getting fired. Maybe it's making a new team, an injury preventing you from returning to your sport or job, or a partner ending a relationship, or if they die. Sometimes these disruptions can lead to something called recall bias or recall discrimination. So, recall bias is when we do not accurately remember a past event or experience, or we leave out details when we're reporting about them. So, we actually believe these events and facts to be true, and this is happening on an unconscious level. So, we're not doing it on purpose. So, one example could be, you're in an unhealthy relationship and the partner ends that relationship, and you're grieving the loss of that relationship. And all you're able to focus on are the positive memories. So it may not have been a good relationship, but then we get stuck in oh, they were the one, and I love them so much, and they did all these things for me. And that might not be accurate, but in those moments, you truly believe it. That's recall bias. Now, recall discrimination is something different. That is discriminating between relevant and irrelevant information. And it's choosing to focus on positive or negative aspects of a relationship. And it's much more conscious. So you are making a decision on what areas of those memories that you want to focus on. So an example in my life would be when my father died. I can remember having a conversation with my brother in which he said, you don't remember the bad times. And my response to that was, I do remember the bad times, but I choose to focus on the positive memories. That's recall discrimination. I'm doing it on purpose, and I'm making a choice of where I'm going to direct my attention and what I'm effectively going to allow to take up real estate in my brain. Earlier, I mentioned that if fractures are left unresolved, there can be a deterioration of mental health. So that occurs when I fill the void of the chair with something unhealthy, sadness, anxiety, substances, whatever it is. And I'm not implying that it's always intentional. The void will be filled whether we choose to fill it or not. What we need to do is fill it in a functional way. And the functional approach is to fill it intentionally. And that's where identity reconstruction comes in. Identity reconstruction is happening all of the time. So if we think about, just our journey with school, we go from being not in school to kindergarten, then from kindergarten to grade 8, and then we have a big shift going from grade 8 to grade 9, and it continues. So these, other major life changes that can contribute to identity reconstruction are things like marriage, divorce, birth, death, starting a new job. All of those things require reconstruction of your identity. So when I go back to the accident and I think about how, like I could walk after the accident, I want to make sure that that's clear, but I couldn't walk properly. My hip was, my leg was all turned in wonky directions, and I really had to consciously learn how to walk properly again. So, that created new physical limitations for me. And I had to rediscover who I was. Everything about me at that point in my life was about fitness. My work was fitness. All my recreational activities were fitness. All my friends were gym rats. So without my same physical abilities, who was I? I had no sense of who that was. So, identity reconstruction requires reauthoring of our narratives about the present and our planned future. Now, we have to incorporate the past. We're not going to erase it, but we still incorporate it into who we are. And that includes the disruption or the collapse. When I'm working with first responders, there's a reality that at some point you are not going to be on the job anymore. So whether it's retirement, mental, physical injury, whatever the case can be, at some point you won't be there. And leaving the job can feel like a loss of purpose, confidence, and pride. And you start asking yourself, well, who am I if I'm not a first responder? Who am I if I'm no longer in the military? Who am I if I'm no longer a public safety personnel? So we have to give consideration of, this use of self when you leave those positions. Are you still a dad? Are you still a son? Do you still have a strong work ethic? Do you still have a relationship with that role? And this is where we can start to reframe some of our language from I am to I was. If you return to the identity mapping exercise from the last episode, I mentioned that a lot of them come down to I am statements when you're thinking about the different parts of your identity. And many people list titles. For example, I might list father, I might list athlete or coach now, firefighter. And these titles and labels are composed of many identity characteristics. And when we're thinking about some of these shifts that have happened, whether it's a simple disruption or a collapse, we want to focus on how many of those identity characteristics remain if you no longer have that title, have that job, have that relationship. And when we're focusing on the identity characteristics, we want to give special attention to the positive characteristics. Those are the things that we're going to tap into because those are the things that we want to reinforce and use as the foundation as we move forward. So we want to have conversations about the likelihood that without that title, those characteristics still remain and thinking about what strengths have helped you survive up until that point. And we want to start with our strengths, our behaviors, our values, the things that drive us and create that foundation. If there are negative characteristics on that identity map exercise, we want to start relabeling them and reconfiguring them into positive characteristics and start thinking about how would someone who love us, how would they describe us? When I do a lot of psychoeducational groups on identity, and it actually wasn't until working on this episode that I really looked at the characteristics of who I was before the accident and when I was kind of recovering. And I can look back and say, even though I was no longer, an active fitness competitor and I wasn't able to walk properly and be, in the gym and doing all those physical activities, I was still very disciplined. I was still very goal oriented. I was still very loyal, honest, and hardworking. I also, I presented as confident at that time. In hindsight, I look back and I think it was actually a mask for many insecurities, and sometimes came across as arrogance because I put that mask on too much. But those are all characteristics that were part of me, even though I was no longer able to do the same, physical tasks that I could do before the accident. Focusing on the positive characteristics, the next step is to find evidence to reinforce those identity characteristics for you. So when you're exploring this, you're looking for evidence outside of the specific title, relationship, or team. So I can think of lots of examples of problem solving when I was a firefighter, but when I was no longer a firefighter, so if I'm the therapist working with the firefighter, I might say to them, okay, give me some examples of problem solving that are not on the job. And what this does, it reinforces that those characteristics remain even when the title does not. And even after a collapse, those characteristics can still remain. So, knowing that, you're now in a position to fill that void left, but in a more functional way. Now, sometimes the change is gradual. We grow a little here, learn something there, life slowly shapes over time. But other times, the change or awareness of change is much more acute. And this is where quantum changes come into play. So, a quantum change refers to those sudden dramatic shifts in identity that feel like they happen all at once. So, even if the conditions were building quietly in the background, unlike gradual identity development, quantum change is conceptualized as a moment of profound insight. It's the experience of realizing and accepting I can't go back to who I was, or recognizing that you are not who you were. So it's kind of that divine aha moment. And as part of the recovery process, you realize something that has fundamentally changed. You're not simply doing life differently, you're seeing yourself differently. It isn't a behavioral change, it's a sudden shift in how you understand yourself and your future. So, looking back, I definitely experienced identity collapse when I wiped out my bike because my perception of my projected future, it completely disappeared. And without knowing it at the time, I started on a journey of identity reconstruction, figuring out who I would be without everything being rooted in fitness and physicality. And at some point in the reconstruction process, I stopped grieving who I had been and what I could do, and I stopped asking, how do I get it back? And whether I liked it or not, I finally reached a point of acceptance that I needed to start authoring a new version of myself. Quantum change occurs in those moments. It marks the point where you acknowledge that your old projected future needs to be replaced by something entirely new, or it already has been replaced by something entirely new. And for me, months after the accident, I think part of me believed I was simply recovering. I was going to physio 5 days a week, massage 4 days a week, learning to walk properly again, working hard because that's who I was. My focus was getting back to the life I had before. And then at some point, and I honestly can't tell you the exact day or time that it hit me, but I wasn't rebuilding my own life. I was building a different one. That realization changed everything for me. Until then, my energy was spent trying to become the old version of myself again. And after that, my energy shifted towards discovering who I could become. And this is where future branching comes in. So, again, identity is based on the past, the present, and the predicted future. And when we look at that predicted future, there is a possibility of several different branches based on choices and unplanned events. So, future branching is the idea that your identity isn't a single straight line, it's a series of possible paths that extend from this moment forward. And when your identity is disrupted, the branch you thought you were on likely no longer exists. Your roots still exist, but new branches become visible. Some branches are shaped by choice, the decisions you make, the values you lean into, the strengths you identified earlier, and other branches are shaped by circumstance. The accident, the diagnosis, the job loss, the relationship ending, getting cut from a team. But the key is this: your future identity is not predetermined, and it's plural, it's branching. After a collapse, people often feel like their future has been erased. And in reality, the collapse erased one branch. And now that that branch is gone, other branches can be seen. Future branching is the process of recognizing that multiple versions of your future self still exist, and you get to participate in choosing which one you grow into. It's not about pretending the disruption didn't happen. Again, we want to incorporate those losses, incorporate that disruption. It's about integrating it into the story and allowing it to guide you toward a different branch, one that still contains your strengths, your values, and your characteristics, even if the title or the role or the relationship has changed. Future branching gives you permission to imagine again, to consider what does life look like if I follow this branch? What identities emerge if I choose this path instead? What becomes possible now that the old projected future is gone? Yes, the chair is gone from that room. But now you have an opportunity to view the room differently. Maybe the room appears bigger than you once imagined. Or maybe you've chosen a different room altogether. As I wrap up, I want to bring this all back to something simple and human. Identity isn't fixed. It's not a single story, a single title, or a single future. It's a living process, and we can and should hold multiple identities. And disruptions, whether planned, unexpected, or completely unwanted, they don't erase who you are. They reveal the parts of you that were always there, even when the title or the role falls away. When collapse happens, it's easy to focus on what's missing. The chair that used to be there, the partner you had, the sport you played, the future you thought you were walking toward. But reconstruction is the intentional act of choosing what fills that void. It's remembering your strengths, your values, your characteristics, the things that existed long before the disruption and will continue long after. Quantum change reminds us that sometimes the shift is sudden. Sometimes the old path disappears overnight. And future branching reminds us that even then, new paths exist. New versions of you exist, and you have choice. You get to participate in choosing which version you grow into. Identity isn't about going back, it's about going forward, but with awareness of the past and the present. If there's one thing I hope you remember from today's episode, it's this. Life will change. Roles will change. Careers end. Bodies age. Relationships begin and end. And some of those changes will be planned. Others will arrive without warning. But none of those experiences have the power to erase who you are. They may change your circumstances. They may change your direction. They may even change your future. But they don't erase your values, your character, your strengths, or your capacity to continue growing. Identity reconstruction isn't about returning to an earlier version of yourself. It's about carrying forward the best parts of you, the best parts of who you've always been, while creating space for the person you're still becoming. So if you're experiencing some disruption right now, I hope today's episode reminds you that you are not broken. You're rebuilding. And rebuilding isn't a sign that you failed. It's evidence that you're still growing. If you found this episode interesting, please like, subscribe, review, leave a comment, share it with someone who you feel might need a reminder that identity reconstruction is about moving forward. If you're struggling with confidence, pressure, or identity in sport, visit paulbrowncoaching.com to book a free consultation. You can also connect with me on Instagram and YouTube at Paul Brown Coaching. Thanks for listening, and remember, progress, not perfection.